Hey guys, welcome back. Today I want to give you an update on our campground approval process. I wish I could say that it's going well. Many of the neighbors who live on the pond want to keep the pond private for themselves for the reasons I've raised in my other video. The opposition has pretty much convinced some members of the City Council to pass a retroactive moratorium that will likely impact how we operate our campground. I'd like to be one of the first to say that I agree with some of the proposed regulations. So let's get into it. During the recent City Council meeting in Sanford, I'll put a link in the description down below for it. A few members of the council raised concerns about our camping proposal. The first concern was over how a year-round campground will put guests in serious public harm. Let's listen to the Deputy Mayor of Sanford speak on this issue.
Maura?
And I don't think the zoning board of appeal, zoning subcommittee would have brought this forward without that, because we firmly believe that winter camping will cause, and camps don't require heating or air, like insulation or heating situations that are sufficient to allow people to live there for the winter. So they actually are allowed to put up structures that are, below the quality of a mobile home. And so there isn't enough, even the code enforcement officer mentioned trying to camp in the winter and how much propane he had to use. To us, the idea of winter camping on campgrounds such as this, when they can use substandard camps, that wouldn't meet year-round housing, that they don't have to provide for facilities that are standards for the year-round, that all provides in my opinion, public health problem, and it is an issue like that. So that's where I would be going.
I'd like to address these concerns presented by the Deputy Mayor. In the park model RVs we are proposing for winter camping, the heating systems and the insulation used to build the units meet or exceed all state and local regulations, which means they are not substandard. Also, these are not mobile homes. They are legally considered RVs. Let's continue listening to the Deputy Mayor.
I agree with you. Some of the other stuff might not be worthy of an emergency moratorium. But for that one thing, that year-round situation, I do think camping in the state of Maine shouldn't be year-round. And that's why all campgrounds don't do it.
Again, I apologize for possibly dropping the ball here. I didn't think to share with the town council members that there actually are in fact year-round campgrounds in Maine. I'll put a link to them in the description down below. Let's continue listening to the Deputy Mayor talk about the current city ordinance that impacts campgrounds.
I've also mentioned to the city manager and to the mayor, it would be nice to have existing campgrounds as part of this conversation, because I think they would have, there's no back and forth going on right now between neighbors and the person who wants to develop the campgrounds. It's actually people who run campgrounds.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure what she's saying in this clip, but we have had 2 meetings that we invited the neighbors to that the council may not be aware of to discuss the proposed campground and its operations. I did tell the town about these meetings, but obviously I should have told each individual council member, including the Deputy Mayor. I apologize for this mistake. The opposing neighbors, by the way, have not invited us to any of their private meetings. Let's continue listening to how the ordinance that impacts campgrounds is out of date.
I think it doesn't even describe camps appropriately, am I right? Some of the stuff that people use for camping is not even technically in the ordinance, and we should allow for that because there are better ways to camp today. So I think that's where I would be going. I think there is some sort of a public health and safety issue with the year-round piece. That alone. And I think that's what John and Bob and I particularly noted in our conversation.
Okay.
All right, I think she's right that the Sanford ordinance that impacts campgrounds is probably outdated and should be updated to reflect the winter camping that is actually currently happening in the state of Maine and other states. My wife and I agree that there needs to be some regulations around what constitutes year-round camping to ensure that campgrounds don't become what the neighbors and one of the city councilors are calling low-income housing. After doing some research, I learned that the town of Wells has come up with some creative ways of dealing with this year-round issue with condo units. I think the ordinance should have language in it that limits a campground stay to something like maybe 180 days. The camper would then have to leave for at least something like 90 days before returning. This allows the campground to provide guest services to people looking for a winter getaway. This length of stay restriction would allow us as campground owners to stay open all year round with some of the park models that will be insulated and heated appropriately for the winter climate. Because our campground only has 39 sites, we need to stay open year round with some sites in order to make it a viable business venture. So I think a duration of stay restriction is actually a good idea. It should eliminate the neighbor and council member fears of creating a low-income housing project and allow us to make enough money to stay in business. Okay, the second issue raised by the council is that the pond could become a nasty mess due to overuse by the additional people that a campground would bring to the pond. I don't know if the deputy mayor or any of the members of the city council are experts on what amount of people will turn a pond into a nasty mess, but I know who does and will share that with you in a moment. But before I get into that, listen to what the deputy mayor goes on to say.
It's going to quickly become a nasty pond if there's going to be that many people.
In order to prevent the campground from turning the pond into a nasty mess, the council is discussing a mandatory 200-foot setback from all neighbors when a campground is proposed. This moratorium will also be retroactive to make sure it will impact campground proposals like mine that have already been submitted and are in the approval process. My wife and I own 113 acres of land for the campground. A 200-foot setback will potentially prevent us from placing the park model RVs 100 feet from the pond, which actually the Department of Environmental Protection will allow. What I struggle to understand is how a 200-foot setback will prevent campers from going down to the water, especially when the opposing neighbors would be open to allowing public access to the pond for the entire town of Sanford. That's 22,000 people. Obviously, they won't all be down there at once, but there could be a couple dozen if there is enough parking. In other words, the deputy mayor is proposing a 200-foot setback to prevent campers from using the pond, and the neighbors have told town officials that they would be okay with public access to the pond for the entire city of Sanford, but not for the campground. That confused me. Because the underlying concern was really the quality of the water being impacted by the introduction of the campground, I called the Department of Environmental Protection and spoke with a representative. I can share her name if you want to reach out to me. I'll paraphrase here. She said that additional swimming and paddleboarding introduced by the campground will not impact the water quality of the pond. She agreed that cutting foliage on the water's coastline, septic systems too close to the water, and the introduction of invasive water species like milfoil are what will negatively impact the pond. These are some of the behaviors the neighbors are already doing on the pond. Watch my other video to see what I mean. Although it wasn't mentioned by the City Council, I think the moratorium needs to include a restriction that prevents campground guests from using any watercraft other than what is being provided by the campground. This will help prevent the introduction of invasive species of plants. I've reached out to the deputy mayor and council members to speak with them about this, and some of them have agreed to speak with me, but others asked me to try and work things out with my neighbors directly, who just don't want a campground at all. This suggestion surprised me because some of the city council members have clearly had conversations with the opposing neighbors of the proposed campground. I would think that they would want to hear both sides of the story. I decided to contact a second person at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection to see if I could find some type of formula or calculation that would allow the city council to calculate how many people could use a 30-acre pond before adversely impacting the water quality. The second DEP contact I spoke with said that a formula or calculation did not exist. He said that he had worked in lake and pond water quality for the Department of Environmental Protection for over 20 years and said that additional swimmers and paddleboarders would not introduce a measurable amount of pollutants to the water. Again, he agreed that the way the neighbors are clear-cutting at the water's edge to get a better view of the pond, placing septic systems too close to the water, and the potential introduction of invasive plants like milfoil are the biggest threat to our 30-acre spring-fed pond that drains into the Great Works River. So there you have it, folks. Don't listen to me, the opposing neighbors, or anyone else who isn't an expert. Call the DEP and ask them like I did. The contact at the DEP went on to say that the fact that the DEP allows the permit to go through shows that they agree that the campground will not impact the ecology of the pond. Now, I want to share all of this with you because at this point, I don't know if this campground is going to get approved or even be a viable opportunity because the 200-foot setback, part of the moratorium, will severely impact our ability to turn a profit. The 200-foot setback being proposed by the deputy mayor to prevent the campground from getting too close to the neighbors will eliminate our ability to use any waterfront property at all. And how does a 200-foot setback prevent serious public danger for the greater city of Sanford? Although we have about 560 feet of waterfront, it is broken up by the abutting neighbors that surround the campground. We of course want to compromise, but some of the neighbors are dead set against the campground, and I'm struggling to get some of the council members to even speak with me. It seems the abutting neighbors want to keep the pond to themselves and don't want to share it with the general public. And again, this is all despite what I'm hearing from the DEP that additional swimmers and paddleboarders won't measurably impact the quality of the pond, especially the way the neighbors have already destroyed part of the pond's ecosystem. If you look at the 560 feet of frontage we have on the pond, it isn't exactly beachfront, and we can only have a 20-foot dock that is 5 foot wide. I doubt that a lot of campers are going to be congregating in swarms during the day at these 3 locations, especially when we are proposing a pool for the campground and individual swim spas for each of the individual park models. We want to offer something unique and high-end in the city of Sanford. Wow, we covered a lot of ground in this video. Let's review. First, the RV park models we hope to use meet all insulation and heating code requirements. No one will be in danger. Second, there are other winter campgrounds in Maine. You'll find links down below. Third, we have invited the neighbors to 2 meetings and they haven't invited us to any of their private events. I tried to join their organization and they replied telling me to reach out to their lawyer. Fourth, a maximum duration stay at the campground should help eliminate neighbor fears that a campground will become low-income housing. Fifth, the Department of Environmental Protection confirmed on 2 occasions that additional swimmers and paddleboarders will not impact the ecosystem of the pond the way the neighbors have already damaged it. Watch my other video on this channel to see the pictures of their destruction. 6. We meet all DEP requirements with our 100-foot setback from the pond and comply with all setback requirements from the neighbors. Placing a 200-foot setback requirement on the campground will not protect the pond from the neighbors. 7th, it's confusing that the neighbors who don't want the campground guests to access the pond are open to a public beach for the city of Sanford and the surrounding communities. Wouldn't the campground guests just use the public beach, especially since the neighbors want the public beach on our property? Also, our 560 feet of frontage has no beach, and we don't want to see more of the pond's ecosystem destroyed beyond what the neighbors have already done. 8th, the moratorium needs to include language that stops the spread of invasive water plants. 9th, council members who have spoken with the neighbors should give us the opportunity to speak with them as well. And finally, reach out to me anytime if you would like a tour of the property. So I hope you appreciate that we are sharing all of this with you. We are getting a lot of opposition, and if you'd like to support us, please consider joining the town meeting via Zoom on May 7th at 6 p.m. The Zoom link is down below. And if you want to learn more about why the neighbors are opposing this campground, watch this next video.